Struggling farmer was hired to bury her, but she opened her eyes before the first shovelful. Didn't know she was millionaire. Please, don't. The voice was barely a whisper, fraying at the edges like a thread pulled too tight. Mason Reed froze mid-swing, his shovel clinking against a rock in the frozen soil. The sound had come from the wrapped figure beside the open grave. His breath caught, misting in the cold night air. He turned slowly, his heartbeat loud in his ears. The burlap tarp lay still, edges tucked in like someone had made the effort to be meek about death. But then there it was again, the faintest motion. A tremble of cloth near where her face would be. He dropped the shovel. The graveyard lay at the edge of Hollow Creek, just beyond the chapel, a hard stretch of earth and frost, marked by wooden crosses and the occasional stone marker, most with names long faded by time and weather. Mason had been digging holes for the dead here since his father passed, a job he never asked for, but took out of necessity. Farming had not been kind in recent years, and the extra coins kept the lights on in the cabin he barely called home. Earlier that evening, a black carriage rolled in from the main road, pulled by a dark horse, and the man who stepped down wore a long coat, city-made and expensive, his face hidden beneath the wide-brimmed hat. He opened the back of the carriage to reveal a stretcher, the body wrapped tight in rough cloth, tied at the ankles and wrists. "No papers," the man said, his voice clipped and unfeeling. "No name, no announcement. She goes in tonight." Mason hesitated. "You the kin?" "Just do what you're paid for, gravedigger," the man snapped, tossing him a pouch of silver that landed with a thud at Mason's feet. No questions. He vanished back into the night without so much as another look. That was an hour ago. Now the wind screamed through the bare trees, rattling the iron gate and pushing at Mason's coat as he dropped to his knees beside the tarp. His fingers shook as he fumbled with the knots, heart pounding. The cloth peeled back slowly, stiff and damp from the cold. Her face emerged, pale and blue-tinged, lips parted, lashes frosted. "Please," she whispered again, barely audible. She was alive. Mason staggered backward, breath catching in his throat. Alive. Sweet Lord above, he lunged forward, pulling the rest of the cloth away. Her hands were cold as stone but twitching. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, frantic rhythm. "I got you," Mason muttered, wrapping his coat around her. "You're all right now. You're all right." She couldn't respond. Her eyes rolled back as she slipped again into unconsciousness, body limp in his arms. Mason lifted her, staggering a little under the unexpected weight. She was light, but the kind of light that comes from going too long without food. As he carried her toward his wagon, he looked back once at the open grave. He left it empty. The ride back to his cabin was rough and slow. The old mule strained against the cold, hooves crunching through snow-dusted dirt. Mason kept glancing at the girl, wrapped in his coat on the wagon bed, her face barely visible beneath the folds. Every now and then she would whimper a broken sound, as if sleep itself was too sharp for her soul. By the time they reached his cabin, the sky had turned black, and the fire in his hearth had long since gone out. He kicked the door open, carried her inside, and laid her gently on his cot near the stone hearth. Then he set to work building the fire with shaking hands, heating water in the kettle, pulling every spare quilt from the trunk. He knelt beside her, brushing her hair from her forehead. Her skin was icy, but not as pale now. "You ain't dying tonight," he whispered, voice hoarse. "Not on my watch." As the fire roared to life, casting dancing shadows across the worn wood walls, Mason sat in the chair by her side, watching every shallow breath she drew. She had nearly been buried alive, and whoever had brought her out to that field had wanted it that way. The wind rattled the old shutters as Mason eased the door shut behind him, arms straining under the slight but fragile weight of the girl. Caleb, his 11-year-old nephew, looked up from the small fire where he was toasting a heel of bread. The boy's eyes widened. "Uncle Mason, who's that?" "Not sure yet," Mason muttered, brushing snow off his shoulders. "Help me get the bed ready." Caleb scrambled to his feet, dragging the patchwork quilt down from the loft. The cabin was small, built decades ago by Mason's father, just 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, and enough space for breath and survival. The walls were lined with shelves of canned peaches and dried beans. Life here was bare but honest. Mason laid the girl down on his bed and gently peeled off the damp layers of his coat wrapped around her. She was burning up. Her cheeks were flushed a violent pink under her sickly pallor. Her lips cracked. Her eyelids fluttered but didn't open. "What happened to her?" Caleb whispered. Mason didn't answer. He didn't have one. The girl moaned softly, her hand twitching on the woolen blanket. "Get the kettle going," Mason said, "and bring that cloth from the water basin." For the next 3 days, time bent and blurred around the small cabin. Snow buried the trails outside, sealing them in. Mason never left the girl's side. He fed the fire with every dry log he had, brewed willow bark tea for her fever, and spooned thin porridge into her mouth, a drop at a time. She never spoke, not clearly, just fragments, mumbled syllables, names maybe, please. A half-formed word that might have been don't or no. Her wrists had faint bruises, rings of purple that told their own story. Her collarbone showed a dark mark too, hidden beneath her worn shift. Mason didn't ask questions. The answers would come when she was ready. On the second night, her fever climbed. She thrashed in the blankets, sweat soaking her brow, muttering something over and over that Mason couldn't make out. Caleb sat nearby, eyes wide with worry. "Is she going to die?" Mason soaked another cloth in cold water and laid it across her forehead. "Not if I can help it." The next morning, Mason found her still, but the flush in her cheeks had faded. Her breathing was steady. He dared to hope. He brewed a fresh pot of broth and left it to cool, then poured it into a chipped cup and set it on the small table beside her. "Come on now," he murmured. "You made it this far. Don't quit on me." He sat by the fire, whittling a block of pine, keeping one eye on her. It was almost noon when she stirred. Her head turned slowly on the pillow, her eyes cracked open, pale gray, rimmed with confusion. She blinked, squinting at the wooden beams above her. Mason rose and stepped to the bed. "You're all right," he said quietly. "You're safe now." She blinked again, her gaze shifted to him, then around the room, searching, maybe remembering. Her lips parted, dry and trembling. "Why?" she rasped, her voice nearly lost. "Why didn't you let me die?" Mason didn't flinch. He pulled the chair closer, sat down slowly and looked her in the eye. "Because you're still breathing." She closed her eyes again, a tear slipping from the corner. Her hand clenched the edge of the blanket. Mason didn't say more. He didn't ask who she was, or where she had come from, or why someone had tried to bury her. There would be time for that. Or not. It was her choice. Caleb peeked in from the other room, saw her awake, and whispered, "She's talking?" "A little," Mason said. The boy crept in and stood by the hearth, watching her with solemn curiosity. "Does she have a name?" he asked. "Not yet," Mason replied. Then to the girl, "You want to tell us what to call you?" Her mouth moved slightly. She tried to speak, then stopped. She turned her face into the pillow, her shoulders shaking. Mason rose. He didn't press. He only adjusted the blanket, made sure her feet were warm, and placed the cup of broth in her hand. "Drink what you can," he said. Outside, the snow continued to fall, silent and endless. Inside, the fire burned steady, and for the first time in days, the girl in the gravedigger's bed didn't dream of death. She could not tell him her name. Not because she refused, because she genuinely did not know. When Mason asked, seated by the hearth, his voice gentle as the fire crackled low, she looked at him with a hollow apology in her eyes and whispered, "I don't remember." Her voice, though soft, was stronger now. Mason gave her a moment, then asked if she remembered anything at all. She furrowed her brow. "A man, a blue coat. He was angry." Mason nodded. "Blue coat, that helps." He looked around, landed on the wind chime by the door, its sound like soft bells in the wind. "How about Blair?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Okay." So she became Blair. Within a week, she was steady on her feet. Within 2, she was helping around the cabin, kneading dough, feeding hens, chopping kindling. She did not complain, did not ask for anything. Caleb adored her instantly. He trailed her like a shadow, asking endless questions, giggling when she praised his lopsided pancakes. She taught him how to whistle, how to braid rope, and how to fold paper cranes from old seed catalog pages. Mason often paused outside the door just to listen, her voice reading aloud, Caleb's laughter echoing against the walls. In those moments, the cabin felt less like survival and more like living. Then one night, while Mason worked in the barn, Blair stoked the fire and spotted a small ledger beneath the shelf. Curious, she flipped it open. It was not a chore list. It was debt. Pages and pages of it. Names, dollar amounts, all owed, all piling. She turned to the last page. Harvest failed, again. Blair shut the book slowly, her heart pinched. This place patched walls, chipped mugs had barely held together, and yet Mason had taken her in. No questions, no expectations. He had given her shelter with nothing to gain. After dinner, when the dishes were done and Caleb had gone to bed, Blair walked to the old chalkboard by the pantry. Mason used it for reminders. She picked up the chalk and wrote, "You saved me without knowing who I am. That's rare." She left it there and returned to her chair by the fire. When Mason came in later, snow in his boots, he paused. His eyes locked on the board, the white words soft in the low light. He read them twice, then looked at her. She didn't speak, just offered the faintest smile. Mason nodded, slow. "Some things you just do," he said, "because you can't not." Blair nodded back. The fire crackled. They sat in silence, no longer strangers, not quite friends. Something deeper had settled between them, quiet and real. No past, no plan, just the day in front of them, and what they chose to make of it. The cold had eased that morning, just enough for Mason to say spring might finally be thinking about arriving. Blair, still called that by habit, though the name was not hers, had gone out to the shed to gather linens from the line, where Mason hung them to dry. She found the coat by accident, an old brown wool thing Mason had tucked away under the bench, stiff with disuse. She shook it out, meaning to brush the dust from it and repurpose it into a blanket, but something clinked inside the inner lining, a pocket, still stitched shut. She fetched Mason's pocket knife, sliced the thread and reached in. Her fingers closed around something smooth, cold, rectangular. A card. She pulled it out, stared. A bank card, embossed with a name, not Blair, Ella. Ella Montgomery. The letters struck her like wind through an open door. She reached deeper. Another item, a folded document, yellowed at the crease, sealed with the notary mark of New York State. Her breath caught as she unfolded it slowly. It was a declaration of inheritance. Ella Montgomery, sole surviving heir to the Montgomery Trust. Assets comprising holdings across 4 states, including real estate, shares, and 2 offshore accounts. Effective immediately, she was entitled to full access upon identity confirmation. Blair. Ella stared at the paper. Her hands trembled. The name was hers. She did not remember it in full, not yet. But a piece of her recognized it, like a distant melody heard again after too many years. Her fingers curled tight around the paper. Then she stood, silent and unsure, and walked back into the cabin. Mason was at the sink, washing up after breakfast, sleeves rolled high, humming low under his breath. Caleb sat cross-legged on the floor, whittling a stick with his tongue between his teeth. Ella placed the card and the document on the table, then stepped back. Mason turned. He dried his hands on a cloth and walked over, glancing down at what she had placed. He read the name, read the letter. His brow furrowed, then slowly smoothed, but he said nothing. He just poured her a cup of tea, and when she sat down across from him, still shaking, he slid the cup to her, steam curling between them, and said only, "That changes things for you." Ella's throat was dry, maybe. "You remember now?" "Some." She wrapped her hands around the cup. "Enough to know This was never supposed to be where I ended up. Mason nodded once. He reached for his coat, opened the door, and began to shovel the front path of snow, same as every morning, like nothing had changed, but something had. That afternoon, Caleb joined her on the porch. He kicked his boots against the steps and said, "So, are you going back to the city?" She looked at him. His face was pink from the wind, his hands red and raw from the cold. He was squinting into the sunlight like it might answer for her. "I don't know," she said. "Seems like people in big houses wouldn't want chickens or cold stoves," he muttered. Ella smiled, small and sad. "You're probably right." Then, more quietly, she added, "But people don't always want what they need." He looked at her, frowning. "Then what do they want?" She hesitated, then answered, "They want to feel like they belong, like they matter." Later that evening, after Caleb had gone to bed, Ella found Mason on the back steps, sharpening his axe by lantern light. She sat beside him on the cold wood. The stars above were sharp and clear. She held the bank card in her hand and turned it over, slowly. "If I leave now," she said softly, "I'll just be someone with money, not someone who was saved." Mason did not look at her, but the whetstone slowed. "You were always someone," he said. "The rest is just circumstance." She swallowed. "I don't think I want to go back to a life I never really lived, not if it means forgetting the one that pulled me out of the ground." Mason set the axe aside, the blade gleaming faintly. "Then stay," he said simply. Ella looked out into the night, the shadows of the trees stretching long across the field, the mountains etched like old promises in the dark. For the first time, the weight of who she had been did not feel heavier than the hope of who she could become, and for the first time, she was not afraid to choose. The knock came just after dusk. 2 hard raps on the door, measured, confident, too polite to be a stranger. Mason looked up from the table, spoon midway to his mouth. Ella froze, the firelight flickering against her wide eyes. Caleb turned toward her, already sensing something was wrong. Another knock, slower this time. Mason stood, crossed the room, and opened the door just a crack. A man in a tailored coat stood on the porch, snow clinging to his boots. His hair was neatly parted, his jaw clean-shaven despite the cold. He smiled, but it was thin and too controlled. "Evenin'," the man said, voice smooth. "Name's Allen." He held out a gloved hand. "I believe you've got someone of mine?" Mason didn't move. "This a missing person report?" The man chuckled softly. "No, sir. More personal. She's family." Behind Mason, Ella had gone pale, a hand to her chest. Caleb caught the shift, his eyes snapping between her and the door. "I've been looking everywhere for her," Allen continued. "Blair, you called her, right? Must have been confused. Real name's Ella Montgomery. She belongs with me." Mason's grip on the door tightened. "You got proof?" The man's smile thinned. "I have history. We were engaged. She took ill, very ill. I arranged everything. I thought she was gone. Imagine my surprise when I heard rumors she'd turned up breathing again." Mason said nothing. "I'd like to take her back now, make things right." From behind the door, a whisper. "No." The man's eyes flicked toward the sound. He smiled again. "There she is. You remember me now, don't you?" But Ella had already slipped out the back, bare feet crunching in the snow, breath ragged as she darted past the woodshed and crouched behind the stable. Her body trembled, her lungs burned. Inside, Caleb moved toward the hearth. He picked up a pencil stub and his sketch pad, quietly started drawing. Mason never opened the door farther. He stared down the man with the kind of silence that didn't bluff. "I think you ought to go," he said. "You don't understand what's at stake." "I think I do, and I think you should leave before you find out what's buried around here isn't just regrets." Allen hesitated, then tipped his hat. "We'll talk again, soon." He turned and walked back to the waiting car, the headlights cutting sharp across the snow. Mason shut the door and locked it, then bolted it, then turned to Caleb. "What did you hear?" "Enough," Caleb said. He held up the drawing. It was a man in a long coat, eyes too small, mouth too flat. Mason showed it to Ella when he found her curled against the wall of the stable, arms wrapped around her knees. She nodded, slow and broken. "His name is Alan Royce. He wasn't just my fiancé. He handled my family's trust. He knew if I died before we married, it would all pass to him as executor." Mason knelt beside her. "He tried to kill you." She nodded again. "He said it would be clean. He gave me something, said it would help me sleep. Then everything went black, and you woke up in a grave. I woke up here." They sat in silence for a while, the wind breathing through the gaps in the barn walls. Then Mason stood. "We're leaving tonight." "Where?" "Up the ridge, old hunting cabin. No one knows about it but Caleb and me." She hesitated. "What about the farm?" "It's a place. You're a person. One matters more." Back inside the cabin, Mason wrote a note on the back of an old grocery list. His pen scratched slow across the paper. "She's not dead, but someone will be." He left it on the kitchen table, beside a pot of stew still warm on the stove. By the time the headlights returned to the road that night, the house was empty. The fire had burned low, and the footprints in the snow led up the hill, into the dark, toward a place where the dead didn't stay dead and the living learned how to survive. The snow had begun to thaw by the time Blair sealed the envelope. She sat at the old kitchen table, her hands steady for the first time in weeks. Across from her, Mason watched in silence, a mug of weak coffee cooling in his grip. Blair folded the letter carefully and slid the contents inside a certified copy of her inheritance confirmation and a handwritten note to the Montgomery family's longtime attorney, Samuel Blackwell. "Once he sees this, he'll know I'm alive," she said. "And if I disappear again, at least someone outside will ask the right questions." Mason nodded. "Smart move." She paused. "Do you think it'll be enough?" He took a sip, then answered honestly, "No, but it's a start." The next few days moved like a long-held breath, tense, careful. Blair mailed the letter through a trusted courier in town, one of Mason's former army friends, who asked no questions and promised it would get to New York, but fear crept back into the walls, especially at night, when every creak of wood sounded like a step, every gust of wind like a knock. Mason began reinforcing the doors again. He checked the windows twice before sleep. He pulled the old .38 revolver from the box under the bed and handed it to Caleb. "Show me your hands," he said. Caleb's fingers trembled, but he nodded. "I'm not afraid." Mason knelt in front of him, loading the revolver with slow, deliberate clicks. "Being ready isn't about fear," he said. "It's about making sure fear doesn't win." Blair watched from the corner, her arms crossed, her heart heavier than she let show. Later that night, she found Mason on the porch, staring out over the frost-covered field. The stars above were cold and sharp, scattered across the sky like forgotten truths. She wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and stepped beside him. "I heard from Caleb," she said. "You're teaching him how to shoot." He asked. "He's 11. He's also smart. And he's scared." They stood in silence for a few moments. Blair's voice broke the stillness, soft and unsteady. "I used to be terrified of dying. Not the pain of it, just the end. The idea that I'd leave this world without mattering. Without anyone really knowing who I was." Mason turned toward her, his breath visible in the cold air. "You matter now." She looked at him. Really looked. "I don't know what's coming. Maybe Alan sends someone. Maybe I walk into